of the literature, you see, and that came out during. So let's, as we go through the next one, to reflect on two things. One, the distinction between government
and extending my word of welcome to each and everyone who's on the platform. Today's webinar, the guest is Professor Kevin Washington Muata Gairi. Let me introduce Prof. Kevin Washington. He's an African-centered psychologist licensed in Florida and Washington, D.C. He's an activist who champions the humanity of the dispossessed and marginalized people. He has taught and then lectured at several colleges and universities in the US and also internationally. Many other national and international organizations have sought his expertise on Black and African psychological matters. Prof. Muata worked closely with Boris L. Hanson Foundation in developing cultural competency for addressing mental health concerns of African descent. He's the past president of the Association of Black Psychologists, a former chair of the Psychology and Sociology Department at Grambling State University. He's a national program director of the Black Marriage Day, a president of the Black Mental Health Matters, a founder and CEO of Roots Africa and Bots, a founding board member of the acting president of the World Mental Health Coalition. He's currently an adjunct professor at Harris Stowe State University. Professor Kevin Muata Gairi's talk today will be on Ubuntu as a psychotherapy in healing African spirit. Prof, I'm going to give over to you and then you can take it from here. I'm going to switch off my camera because of my unstable internet connection. And then you can take us from here. Thank you and you are most welcome. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. It is a pleasure. Thank you for the introduction. It is a pleasure to enter this conversation on the international level, to be able to meet and discuss this topic of Ubuntu in the context of healing African people. So I greet you with Sabubona. For those that are here, that Sapile. I see that many of us from South Africa are here. Also, the DC family is also on this in this conversation. I appreciate you all for coming in from the DC Go-Go area and also from the Atlanta area. I see Reverend Dr. Lomax is here. So, and also from the Graham family, Gramlin family, I see Dr. Martin Lamel. It is, again, a pleasure to enter into this conversation about healing in the context of African people. Too often we utilize alien constructs to try to engage in the healing process of a population. Therapy and or healing techniques are akin to a cast to a broken arm or leg. The cast provides the structure for the bone to mend, just as therapy provides the same. If there is no prior knowledge of what the bone looked like prior to its being broken, then the cast will be placed on in the incorrect fashion. The same goes for understanding the African psyche. If there's no understanding of what it looked like prior to the breakage, if there's no understanding as to what facilitated the breakage in the first place, the rupture that took place, then they're placing the healing devices of therapy, other things, would simply cause it to ill form. And too often we've used alien constructs to try to heal an African reality. And as a result, we end up in an ill-formed place. We end up in a place of misidentification where we disidentify from ourselves, where we assume somehow that the oppressive forces are those things that can be used to heal us. We cannot use the oppressor's tools to engage in destroying the oppressor's house. So we have to be clear about this process of healing, we somehow think that utilizing the normative structures of those that have facilitated our destruction would actually bring about some level of healing, and that is a place of ill health. And so we have to move beyond that to be able to honor something that goes deeper than that. The issue is that if we begin to examine African reality, we can see then that African people, and I don't want to romanticize or glorify the idea of African, because we know that Africa is comprised of many countries that were divided, bifurcated, primarily as we use them today by the Berlin Conference. So Europeans did that. So we divided along those lines. Also, there are different languages. There are different so-called nations, ethnic nations, and/or tribes. So we do not want to assume somehow that there is this one identity. But what we can understand is that what came out of the continent, what continues to move the entire world, comes from the essence of those people that came from the continent that's now known as Africa. We can talk about El Kabylon, Tasseti, Tameri, Taiwan. We can go through a plethora of the names that have been used over the centuries. But what we do know is that the genius that has moved the world as it relates to all things great and wonderful, from religion to air conditionings that go into homes and houses, we see that the African genius has played a role in that. And too often we try to use, again, European constructs and ideas to somehow facilitate and create some healing, and that's not going to have us in a healthy place. And so I just want to share this conversation today about what it means to deal with the healing of a population. This is coming from content that is soon to be released in a book this summer. We have at least two coming out. One deals with Ubuntu Psychotherapy in general. So this is the mock-up of the title. So this is part of that body of work, Ubuntu and Psychotherapy. What does it look like? The second book is going to look at the idea of Ubuntu in the context of marriage and family or something like that, and then black men next, and then marriage and family beyond that, and then deal with African women and girls. So that is it's a 3 or 4 book process that we're unpacking here, just so that we can be clear. What we're looking at healing or addressing is the dynamic associated with the transgenerational trauma that has been caused by European aggression. We know that some call this the Ma'afa, the great suffering. We know that it was not a matter of the middle passage. It sounds like we're walking down a hallway. It was not walking down a hallway at all. It was a walk of hell. If we begin to examine the process, if we look at even how the void trekkers and others moved into South Africa, simply talking about the Cape of Good Hope and how they were fighting a passageway around Africa and how they paused there and then began to have an incursion into the continent, into that country, to take on the Khoikhoi and the San and others, and then move into spaces of the Ndebele and the Swana, and to deal with the Xhosa and the Zulu. We see how they move through and begin to just simply take over and not simply coexist. They found ways to try to co-opt the genius of a population, co-opt the lifestyle, and then to create a condition of hell. That is common. If we see what happens to Africans in Germany and how they were exterminated, we see what happened to Africans in the UK and what happened to Africans in the United States. There is a commonality of how one population of European descent have treated African people. At the same time, there is a commonality and a commonness. Now, people from the African continent actually see and intuit the world. They're operating from two distinct worldviews. And so we talk about the healing that returns people back to their worldview that allows them to be healthy, whole, and sane. So we're then addressing dynamics of the transgenerational trauma. Some, again, have all of these names. And so we're looking at ways to address this. In the U.S., we know about the lynchings, the castrations, the maiming, the mango. We can go through South Africa. We see how people were chased and had tires placed over their bodies, and then how the tires were set afire. We see all of these horrific treatments that took place. They all were moments of torture, of dehumanization. The idea of rape and molestation that took place, degradation, destabilization, was all a part of Western thought and how Western thought moved into the dehumanization of a population. At any given point, put it in the chat, stop and talk and pause, because when I start talking about this, I do indeed get excited about it because it is something that I have a great deal of passion around. But more importantly, I have, the ancestors keep giving me insight about how to deal with this. We've tried to use certain terms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason that we move away from this idea of post is because post means that you've gotten past it. If we are continually experiencing the dynamics of such trauma, if we're continually experiencing the dehumanization, if we continue to see things that happen to our brothers and sisters as they are in Northern Africa, if we see what's happening to individuals in and around South Africa, we see all of these things taking place. If we see the movement going on with Niger, Mali, and Guinea, and we see how they're moving away from the oppressive forces of France, we see all of these things taking place. We recognize that we're not in a moment of post, we're in a moment that it continues. And so a person in South Africa that hit that, who I saw this after I understood this idea of pest, was a Straker, and Straker talked about this continuous traumatic stress that goes on, not the issue of post, but it's something that is going on. And so he talked about this in the context of the anti-apartheid mental health movement, or the idea of the apartheid and how it impacts people. We talk about the issue of pests. It is persistent enslavement, systemic trauma, protracted residual effects of the enslavement experience on a population. Whether we talk about the issue of again, enslavement in the U.S., talk about the trade that we call the trade is called the Ma'afa, or the idea of how can you talk about a trade when there was no equal sharing of wealth from the trade? At least in a trade, there is some benefit that occurs between two populations. That did not occur. So there was not a trade. It was not a swap. It was not a walk down the hallway. We talk about the Ma'afa, the great suffering of African people. And so it is ongoing. It is persistent. It is ongoing. The enslavement identity, ideology is that Europeans are superior to all others. It is systemic. It runs through everything from the UN and how the UN organizes, how, again, Africa is bifurcated, a split, how we see ourselves in religion. We somehow adore Abrahamic religions over anything else. So we have all of these systemic conversations going on in education, that Western education is more, is greater than what came out of ancient Kemet with the Medu Neter and everything else. And I Petasut, the greater universities that existed prior to the Greeks coming into the space. As a matter of fact, the Greek historian Herodotus says that when he arrived to the place where he found the Africans in the northern region in what is now called Egypt and Kemet, he said that their face looked like it had been kissed by the sun, meaning that they were not the same complexion, and yet they spent their years there learning and growing in education. So in reality, then all education comes out of that space. So if we're going to talk about the healing work, we have to begin to go back to that space, to our space, and understand where true healing takes place. So the trauma of the enslaved process has us in a quandary. The quandary is that we shy away from African names. We shy away from African ways of being, African dress. We shy away from African languages. One of some of the work that we're doing in the Gambia is facilitating a process in education where children learn in their area language first, whether it is Jola, or whether it is Wolof, whether it is Mandinga. They're learning in their language first, and then they learn English, as opposed to going the other way around, assuming that somehow if they learn English first, they're better humans. That is not the case. All languages do what they do. Languages are designed for us to communicate with one another, so there cannot be one language better than another. And so we have this process of pest, where we are concerned about the language we speak and the way we dress, the foods we consume, and where we travel to, and where do we go to school, and who educated us, and all of these things are part of a global aspect of traumatization that we have to begin to realize that it is an ideology. An ideology of enslavement was predicated on the notion that Europeans were superior to all others. So if we're going to talk about the healing process, we have to be clear about how we do such. So the healing process has to be able to draw upon the knowledge, the wealth, the understanding, and the experiences of a population. Have to understand the techniques, have to account for the events that a group has gone through. You cannot deal with the healing process if you don't understand the events that have caused the rupture. You cannot enrich the spirit if you don't know what the spirit is all about and how it functions. If you believe that somehow my spirit, the way I function, is inferior, then you cannot possibly engage in healing me, because I've been a part of my healing, because you will perpetuate this idea that somehow I am less than. And so then my healing process for you is me seeing myself as not being myself. And so that is where we keep finding ourselves. We keep looking at this idea of the impact. Some say, well, it's just psychological. It is not. It impacts every aspect of our being physiologically. We understand the process of dealing with the issue of race and racism and oppression, the stress response that goes on in this, how the allostatic load is there, and how we have high occurrences of disease, especially in the U.S. and in places where in the diaspora, where there's high blood pressure, and it's beginning to happen more in Ghana, and even in the Gambia. We see this poor glucose regulation, lowered immune system, coronary heart disease, and all of these associated with coping with the dynamics of oppression, racism, and the issues of dehumanization. So if we want to really deal with the healing, we must have the healing that is empathic to the reality of a population. It is that has an understanding of the manner in which the Utamawazo or one organizes themselves. And the healing techniques must take into the rupture, and it must be multimodal. It can't just be one way. So when we talk about this idea of multimodal, what then becomes the notion of an African essence or African way of being? First and foremost, we see that when we go throughout the entire societies, we see something very common. The notion that spirit is sacred, that things seen as on the spiritual realm has some level of elevation, that all things are seen as spirit, things are seen as being connected. There's a union between the sacred and the mundane. Whether we talk about societies that look at the idea of having the part of the body, and we could talk is more that goes into this conversation, but a part of self, like among the idea of clay, God, and Daya. Daya is a part of the self in West Africa among the Bamana. They talk about this issue of a part of self being in the physical realm and the spiritual realm at the same time. That when that part of ourselves leaves us, Daya leaves us, the sacred shadow leaves us, we are stuck like deer in the headlight. It's what we call in the West schizophrenic. And so there's understanding that there's a connection between the sacred and the mundane. The idea that John Biti says that life is religion and religion is life, that there's no separation between the two, that all things are moved where one gives reverence to the divine and through all actions. Whether it was my grandfather in Louisiana farming, and when he plowed the soil and the vegetables came out of the earth, he would say, praise the Lord, praise God, right? He gave praise to a higher power. Or the idea of the Zulu, the name Zulu means people of the heavens, which means there's no disconnect between self and the idea of self being tied to spirit. Cause and effect are seen as spiritual phenomena, and to attend to the mind is to attend to spirit. We have a model here. I'm not going to belabor the model, but the model talks about how we have to begin to look at the experiences that one has encounters, the worldview that one operates from, and the normative structure that has been imposed upon them, and how we get back to renormalization and a realignment with our true purpose. I'm not that this is not that conversation, but I just simply want you to be aware of a model for doing that work. Yes, sir. Blum, you have something you want to say? Nope. Okay. Again, if you have anything, please put it in the chat. Slow me down, because I tell you, I get on fire about this. When we talk about an African paradigm, again, the value of the collective is the most salient aspect of existence. And Western psychology is predicated on understanding the individual, the person by themselves. So it's a person in therapy. However, as a therapist, I have never dealt with a person in therapy ever. It's always been the person, and they bring in their relationships with other people. So this myth of a person being separated from others is simply a myth that Europeans desire. The West tends to advance, but it does not exist. Even the word individual in English IN means not, DUAL, duality, the idea of DIVI in the middle, divide. It is a duality that can never be split. So even in their word individual, there is this idea of existence beyond simply the person. The idea that communal self is a key to total health. How am I in the context of others, and how are others in the context of with me being in that given space? Spirit is a primary source of health, healing, and holism. And healing of the spirit is healing of the body. So when we then look at the parameters around African psychology, around which Ubuntu is based, again, we say the same thing, recognize that spirit is in all things, a picture of people's journey. We recognize that everybody is on a particular journey to engage in certain activities. The Yoruba talk about Ori, and that you have the Ori that you come from Olodumare with the God concept, a purpose, a destiny, and you come to earth to fulfill that. Krabia among the Akan. This concept is replicated over and over again, that there is a journey, a life journey that people are on, and that we engage in fulfilling it through our interactions with one another. That is not a part and parcel of the Western construct of what it means to be human. Therefore, their model for healing does not take into account the communal aspect of what it means. That to help one increase their strength on their journey is part of the work, and keep people aligned with their purpose is essential, and to acknowledge that all people have purpose. So what do we mean then when we talk about Ubuntu and beingness? Well, we know this concept of Ubuntu is a Zulu term, a concept. Ubuntu speaks to the idea of interrelatedness, of humanity, an indivisible wholeness that exists. UBU refers to being, into you refers to universal unifying life force. People often say that it means I am because we are, therefore I am, and it becomes very, very cliche. However, when we really dig into the term UBU, being, the idea of what it means to be and to become, right? This notion of essence, of being, and that there's a unifying life force, an energy, a spirit that runs through all things, that it is a being that has this unifying life force through it. It is greater than simply talking about I am because we are. It's greater than that. It suggests that there is some type of presence that I have that extends beyond my physical, and that because of that, we are interlocked with one another. This term, and we'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. This term Ubuntu, say how can you say that is African when it just comes from the Zulu? Well, Umundu, Umuntu, Bumuntu, Bumuntu, Bamoto, Gimuntu, Hunu. The idea of all of these speak to the same thing about Ubuntu. Even the concept among the Igbo talk about this issue of the ant has the capacity to do the unthinkable when it joins with others. And so there is that construct, Ubiyanada, right? The idea that these things are joined together. This is more African than it is European. You do not see this idea of interrelatedness. As a matter of fact, in the US, it says that it was built through rugged individualism, right? And so there's a difference in the way people intuit the universe and how they move. And so how does this inform therapy? The idea of what do we talk about with reconnecting? What are we reconnecting people with? It's tying them back in with their beingness in the context of other people. It is imbuing their essence, not simply talking about how do you function, how do you engage in certain behaviors, but how do you restore your true essence, right? Your true inner being, your worth, your value. Those things are things that we actually feel when we begin to feel disrespected. It is not the issue of the disrespect. It is the issue of somehow my essence has been disavowed, right? Informing of a purpose, right? Buttress one for elevation, and to have the integration of one in a wholeness, a connectedness. That's a part of the Ubuntu, the idea of humanity, tolerance, and respect, right? The idea of humanity. What does it mean to be human? Tolerance, right? How to engage in honoring one another, and then to deal with the issue of respect. I submit that at some level, this has been one of the things that has caused African people the greatest amount of challenge, because of assuming that they're always dealing with other people that see humanity in the same way. And so that is problematic because others do not see humanity as having some kind of egalitarian or equal footing, or having the idea of equally sharing this notion of sacredness and divinity. Some see it as the issue of being superior and inferior. And so there's more about that. I don't want to take our discussion away to talk about that level of sickness, but I do want to just mention that is part of the thing that often trips us up is because we begin to assume that our humanity is the same as others. We see the idea of human in general. Human is sacred. Expressions of familiar essence is there. How do we connect with one another? The seed of the divine is in within every one of us, and the idea is how do we expand? How are we expansive beyond what we actually encounter? Now we know that they also have the proverb Ubuntu Gabanya Bantu, which says that an individual's humanity identity is expressed in relationship to others. The Zulu say Ubuntu Gabantu, which means a person is a person because they're other people. That is not the same thing as I am because we are. This idea, both of these speak to my worth and value is predicated on my connectivity to you, that I have meaning inside of that and vice versa. So I am a person because you are a person, but if you're not a person, we have another situation going on. This idea of Ubuntu Gabanya Bantu says that my humanity, my identity is expressed when I'm in your context. The idea that if I were on this particular call right now and there was nobody listening, I simply be somebody just talking to myself. But because you were here, I'm talking to someone and vice versa. Because you listen to me, then there's something happening and there's a relationship between us. And that in this process, we both have a different meaning. And in a moment when we shift to Q&A, we have a different relationship. So the idea is that our meaning, our growth, our development is predicated on how we connect and tie with others. That is not, again, a part of a Western idea. Theirs is about who they are and how they function. And again, and whatever they desire to do is a law and order, and it doesn't matter. One of the things that happens is that people begin to assume that Ubuntu is about being passive, or one cannot move forward and get things done because they always think about others. No, at some level, because you are a threat to what I deem to be human, you have to be addressed, right? And there's a name, for example, Kamal means peaceful warrior. That I must engage in the process of war to make sure that we can establish humanity again, because you are not expressing that. And so we see some of these resistant moments are happening all over, and they've always happened among African people once they realize that this is not the same type of humanity that we deem to be sacred to our community. Koza talks about the African communalism has been a concept that sees human in terms of collective existence. And so he talks about this issue of supportiveness, cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. So it exists. Jetje says that African communalism is a kinship-oriented, self-ordered way of moving, the idea of reciprocity from Ghana. Mabulu reminds us that at some level there has been erosion of African communalism because of, in part, identifying with the oppressor. But Koza also reminds us about the values of African value system that means humanness or being human, a worldview characterized by such values as caring, sharing, compassion, communalism, communocracy, and related predisposition. This idea of a collective consciousness, that there's something that ties us all together. Jomo Kenyatta says that nobody is an isolated individual from Kenya. His uniqueness is a secondary fact about him. The idea that what makes me unique is secondary. First and foremost, I am related to somebody else. I belong to somebody else. I belong to a community, and the belonging is a thing that often that we strive for in the context of the West, because we're always trying to find ways to belong, and we'll share why that's important. Ubuntu, according to the Desmond Tutu, is the essence of being human. It speaks to the fact that my humanity is caught up and is inextricably bound up in yours. I am human because I belong. It speaks about wholeness. It speaks about compassion. A person with Ubuntu is welcoming, hospitable toward warm, and generous, willing to share. The quality of Ubuntu gives people resilience, enabling them to survive and emerge still human despite all efforts. to dehumanize them. And we see this has been the common conversation of African people in the context of the aggressive nature of the West, that there has been this still move to be human and to move with resilience in the context of those that seek to dehumanize us. Among the Bantu Congo, they suggest that we are a part of a biogenetic rope. And this is the same ideology exists in different forms throughout many African societies. The idea that the biogenetic rope is there, that we go from the past, that is those that have come before us, and also those yet to be born, and we're in between those two phases. And that there are things called makolo or knots that have been tied on our biogenetic rope. These are traumatizing events. These are things that have come along to disrupt our beingness, right? And so if we have too many of these these knots, we operate like Ndoki. Ndoki is a non-human being. A Kenu Ka in ancient Kemet, a Kamko among the Akan. It's the same concept, to operate without soul and or spirit. Sekere Folo among the Bamana. We see the same idea that when there are too many traumatizing events, it disrupts the soul and our spirit, and one begins to be non-human. And so part of the function and role of a population is to be able to go in, delve in, and untie the knots, the makolo, to untie them, to unwork them, to be able to heal and to mend, and to make sure that the rope, the biogenetic rope for the progeny, does not have these knots in it, and so that they have a better way of being. We get there through dreams, through visions, through mystery, possibilities. All those things are there, and that it's important to understand the yet to be born are that the dreams and visions of what's there. So we do things from the past to eradicate those things by moving forward. Therapy then is about untying the knots of spirit that have gotten tied there. The human desire, why Ubuntu is so critical, is that there's always a human desire to feel connected in general for most people. There are some people that have certain anomalies that disallow them from feeling connected. In general, there's this idea of wanting to feel connected. And disconnect leads to disruption. And disruption then creates a condition where there's chaos within a given community. So we have to recognize the things that make us feel disconnected. And when we are taught to dishonor our ancestors, when we are taught to disavow where we have come from, our heritage, our language, it begins to create a disconnect between us and our true power. Among the Zulu, you have to perform umzabezi. If you don't do proper ritual umzabezi, then you experience what's called akufa kwabantu, abapanze basifulatele. The idea of abapanze basifulatele is withdrawal of ancestral protection, will lead you into a space of having ukufa kwabantu, which are metaphysical illnesses of the people, right? We see the same conversation among the Zulu. We see the same conversation among the Yorubas, the same idea that if we do not have the connection with those that have gone before us, the connection with those around us and those yet to be born, then we end up in a place of ill health. So we recognize in the Ubuntu and in therapy that life attracts to it what it needs to be fortified. That there's a way that we draw things in our space to be fortified. You can watch a trickle of water move down a windowsill or glass, or watch a trickle of water go stream. It continually finds other elements, like elements of water, and it becomes more and more intense. There's an energy, there's an inside of that water that allows it to connect in a way that it becomes greater. And so it can become a trickle to a stream, to a river, to an ocean, a lake and an ocean. It moves in that manner because it is attracting to it what it needs to become better. The same is for the soul and our spirit. And if we have a disconnect, then we have fragmentation taking place. Growth is intended upon how we are fortified and receive energy from others, and how we give that energy as well. And then humans are imbued with essence, which seeks optimal expression. And that's how we end up existing. There's an element of us that came from people who desire to extend their existence or not, but we end up here as having children, or being children of other people. And so this idea that this optimal expression is always there, but when you don't have the chance to express that, that's where you end up with ill health. So humanity acknowledges the essence of self and others, being that recognizes the interrelated aspects of things. Self is divine, the notion of universal consciousness or soul, and to be human is to be spirit. That's the work that we do. We recognize the idea of the trauma that has taken place. We don't want to overlook traumatizing events and our role in this traumatizing experience. Yes, others have done some things to African people, but also we've done things to ourselves by not seeing ourselves as a group, as a family. So it's initially part of what we saw ourselves as, what again, Akan, we saw ourselves as Ga, as Fanti, as Tree, or we saw ourselves as Mosa, or Indabella. We saw ourselves as Jollof, as Mandinka. We saw ourselves as these other groups, but not seeing ourselves as a people who were being encroached upon, because they saw themselves always as a people, even if they don't speak the same language. And so we understand these dynamics of trauma. The persistent and systemic trauma is ongoing, and we have to look at ways of working through the elements of trauma. We know that part of this is part of this requires us to engage in self-regulation. That is, identifying energy flow, mood, physiological arousal, addressing physical and emotional needs that take place, that there are things that happen to us in different spaces. There's certain things we have to look at in Brazil, in Jamaica, in Barbados, that's distinct from what happened to Africans in the US or on the continent in West Africa, so forth. We have to be able to understand at some level, how do we readjust the energy flow, the mood, the physiological arousal? How do we deal with the issue of the somatization issues that take place within the body? Are people aware of what's happening to them and where they're feeling discomfort? Why is there an issue of breast cancer in Ghana among African women that is where the cancer is more aggressive than in any other place outside of the United States? So there's a connection there between the two. The idea of the somatization, the psychosomatic phenomena that took place, because when we begin to look at the ailments, especially in the U.S., of what is breaking down, we see things like high occurrence of breast cancer. What was violated during the enslavement experience? The breasts. Many Black women, African women, had to be wet nurses for their oppressor. So you have a very confused breast, having to feed the oppressor's child, and sometimes not having enough substance to feed their own child. And so these things are part of that. The ovarian cancer, the uterine cancer, all those things, the reproductive organs were not a part of the ownership of a population. So women could not own their reproductive rights, but they were not there. And so these things are there. If you look at the proliferation of prostate cancer, again, males being forced to be breeders. You may love someone, but you have to breed with somebody else. So all these things are there. So we have these somatic issues that have to be examined. Dysregulated life, that there are things that cause a dysregulation on a continuum, perpetual disruptions. Whether we talk about the issue of, again, France disrupting life for people in West and Central Africa. We talk about the issue of dysregulated life in Barbados, with the disruption of the UK and what it does to dysregulate life in Jamaica or the Brazil. It's the same phenomenon. The assaults on spirit are prolific, profound. We have to be able to examine it. So healing occurs through spiritual alignment. How do we do that? By acknowledging the idea of NTU, a unifying life force. We recognize the idea of connectedness, the idea of understanding who you tied to. We understand that people have to recognize that they're here for a bigger purpose than simply survival. We are reminded in the U.S., Reverend Dr. Lomax talks about dressing and driving, drinking and dining. We are into a show. My grandmother says we'd be an outside show to an unfriendly world. This idea of trying to prove oneself to something that doesn't even desire to approve of us. So the communal healing is paramount. What do we mean by communal healing? We're not simply talking about going into therapy, but when a person comes into therapy with me, with the Ubuntu concept, I'm understanding, how are you connected to anybody else? What is it that you do? How do you move in the world? Who do you see? Who do you honor? Who respects you? Right? We begin to examine the connections that one has with others. We recognize that people are a trifold being moving in 7 distinct directions. trifold being, as we mentioned before, we are past, we're present, and we're future. And that our movements in the world are in 7 directions. The idea we move inward to be able to understand how to heal. We move rightward to understand how to have love for family and connection. We move frontward. That is that we think about ways pre-paving the way for those coming behind us. We move downward to get substance out of the earth to be able to heal and nurture the body. We move leftward to be able to check for our enemies. We move backwards to be able to understand our collective wealth that we've come from. We move upward to be able to understand cosmic consciousness or dreams. And so these 7 different directions are element ways that we begin to connect. So we ask questions about how are you moving in the world where you're able to honor your trifold nature that in these 7 different directions. Within the U.S., there are things called family reunions and line dances. And in line dances, we see almost every dance moves people in 7 distinct directions where they move left, they move right, they move forward, they move back, they dip down, turn, and spin and go into different directions. That is, at some level, a ritual of connection. We see some of these same dances, movements occurring within African societies, where it's Kroba, where no matter where we find it, we find the same thing. We watch the Zulu dance of always moving down with power, or we watch dances in West Africa where there's movement that tends to go upward and flow, and it tends to move in these directions. It is the idea of connecting with spirit and spirit beingness. Now, also, we move that way internally. And so we talk about the issue of healing. I simply want to get ready for question and answers. There's much more to this, but when we get to a place of this healing work where this alignment that takes place with spirit essence, with being, there's a tendency to do what this author created here, to think and act deliberately rather than from fears based on past experiences, to unmistakably have the ability, unmistakable ability to enjoy each moment. A loss of interest in judging others, in judging self, a loss of interest in conflict. We spend a lot of time as a people in conflict. Our conflict was with ourselves, with each other. Who's African and who's not? Are we really African or not? Are we really from this space or not? And so we spend more time entertaining conflict than understanding how to move in spirit, in consciousness, right? The ability to worry has to be lost, because worry does nothing but kill us. People die more from what's eating them than from what they're eating. People die more from what's eating them, that is their thoughts, their worries, their concerns, than what they're eating. So we have to be clear about the things that are destroying us from inside. You have a frequent overwhelming episodes of appreciation, contented feelings of connectedness, frequent attacks of smiling. I've had this happen to me in the Gambia, also in South Africa when I was there. This idea of even when there's not a lot, there's still a connection that people have where they can have joy, have peace, have expressions of happiness without having a lot. So I just wanted to slow us down there. There's much more here that we can cover. I just simply wanted to pause, make sure that we don't move past questions that people may have. I'm going to go to where I'll pick back up again if we get there. Okay. I will say modalities of this idea of healing also comes through doing work around spoken word. How do you author words? The idea of drum, again, laughter work, breath work, poems. Ayo Hindi talks about breath work, songs that are written, and so forth. So there are a variety of things that we can talk about here, but I simply wanted to give an overview, a look into what is Ubuntu and why is it so important. It is important because we cannot use the oppressor's tools to engage in the healing and restructuring of the African soul. We must recognize that there are disruptions. They continue to happen to us, and that they move us from our own humanity. And we often then begin to question our humanity without recognizing that we come from people who understood that I only have agency and existence because of other people. My value and worth is enhanced by me being able to express it. My children raised me to the position of parent when they were born as children, but also I raised them to be able to be adults. My grandmother, my mother was raised a grandmother when when her grandchildren were born, my children were born. So people are always on this particular journey of being elevated because of one another. But at the same time, we have an obligation and duty to share that. We ask the question, how do you feel connected? Who do you feel connected to? We ask the question, do you engage in proper ritual that connects you to those that have gone before you, not the issue of being spooky, but the issue of being connected. Do you recognize the Abapanzi, the ancestors? Do you recognize those that made it possible for you to stand? Do you recognize those that taught you how to simply even use the restroom? Do you recognize those that have gone before you? Do you acknowledge the fact that you are surrounded by people, that you're crossing paths with people that are designed to facilitate your growth and development on your journey? And do you recognize that you're doing things for perpetuity, that things that you do now will enhance or detract from what is happening after you? These are things, ways that we address this idea of therapy, not the issue of trying to survive the hells of the Western thought, but how to thrive, how to move into being and becoming all one has been here to be and to become. So I will pause here and look at, turn it back over to you for Q&A or whatever has to happen at this point.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We really appreciate your thoughts and sharing all these very important discourses that I think is part of healing and part of also liberation. I'm going to quickly make some few reflections, and then I'll open the floor for questions, comments, and whatever that colleagues wants to make. I think what we have learned from you, Kevin, I'm going to leave my camera off, you were trying to share with us so that we can understand Ubuntu as how we are connectedness, or it is connectedness, and then what are we connected to? We are connected to the world, we are connected to the community, we are connected to our culture, and this is how Africans see, or our healing is centered around those. You gave us a little bit of the Zulu cosmology. I'm speaking from South Africa, and then you were trying to help us to understand that cosmology is about how people organize their universe. And then this is organized within particular values. And that can be the family values, that can be the beliefs, that can be the ethos, that can be the culture, that can also be informed by our tradition. And what is important about that is about the value that we give to, or what we call it, the axiology, which is the true values that we examine through how we do things. You also take us through and then also reflected in terms of how we can heal as people. And then there is to heal as people, as African way of healing is through human interaction. And then also taking acknowledgement of the presence of both the internal and also external variables that are there. You highlighted on certain issues that are very critical, where you were telling us about the plethora of names that were given to us as people, just to label us differently. And then Ubuntu as a psychotherapy to say, for us to heal, because we went through serious transgression, because of colonization, because of marginalization, because of slavery, because of disfranchisement. And then we need this kind of healing. And then how Europeans have, caused this particular trauma. And then you have unpacked that was caused through torture, that was caused through rape, that was caused through dehumanization, that was caused through degradation, and then also despiritualization. Kevin, you also took us further just to understand, to say, as much as we need healing, we are in a moment, and then in this moment is a continuous moment of traumatic stress. And then you term that as a pest, which is a post-enslavement systematic trauma, which is caused by the spiritual well-being of the African people, the psychological devastation, the spiritual disruption that is caused, economic disinheritance, political disfranchisement. You highlighted all those. so that we can understand this trauma of pest. What is important is that you share with us to say, for us to heal, we should not shy away from our own practices, from our own traditions, from our own languages. That is very central. That is what you share with us. And then you said trauma of African enslavement, it continues because it's rested somewhere in our psyche, in also in the emotional and the spiritual realm. You were reflecting on how best then can we heal in the spiritual realm. You said healing and reality of our people is very important. You gave us that kind of a multimodal approach for healing, which is the spiritual sacredness. All things you were sharing with us to say everything is spiritual. And then all sets in is connected. And then union between the sacred and the mundane is very important. You were reflecting around issues of life is religion and religion is life, which I think we have learned on that. You reflected on issues of the African paradigm, which is about the value of the collective, of the salient elements of existence, and then ideal of the communal self-knowledge. You also touch on the African psychology, which is about the recognition of the spirit and the Ubuntu. And then you were using this term of Ubuntu just to reflect, to say, where does it come from? How did it evolve from the African perspective? You made an example about the isiZulu, which is Ubu means being, and then Ntu means unifying the life forces. And then how Ubuntu informs healing as a process of reconnecting, imbuing essence, and then also informing us, and then also sharpening how we perceive life. You took us through the Ubuntu and the humanity, and then also the tolerance that needs to be there, and then how we should view Ubuntu or humanism as a sacred and also a familial essence, the seed of the divine, and also that is informed by our own experiences. You reflected on certain proverbs about umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. In another language, in my language, we say motu, ke motu, kabatu. Which is about the African communalism, which is about the collective existence, which is about supportiveness, which is about collective consciousness. That's what you shared with us. And then you were also trying to amplify the issue that nobody is isolated. We are who we are because of others. The essence of being human, and then because I am, therefore I belong. You share many things with us. I'm going to pause there, and then I'll open the floor for questions. I'm sure colleagues will raise their hands, and then we can also check on the chat box, Kevin, and then also maybe respond to some of the comments that are on the chat box. Colleagues, maybe you can show by... Yes.
I'm saying Gibona Kakla. Thank you very much, Gibona. Thank you so much. That was powerful.
Thanks,
that was very good. I could listen to that lecture again. That was really good.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm sure you can raise your hands. Kevin, if you are able to check on the charts from that side, and then maybe we can respond to the questions that are raised.
Good. So also adding to that, you mentioned some of the Zulu constructs. One is the Umtlobo, the idea of the universality or connectedness. That is a part of that guides the conversation, right? The diversity and knowledge of relatedness or individuality, that everything is connected. There is a question. It says that you might have addressed this earlier. I'm sorry to take. It just skipped. I just lost it. Let me go back. Take you back. As I joined late due to connectivity, I am curious to learn why you use the names. Okay. So the question, the query, I did not address this issue. There's a process of movement. Moving, first of all, Kevin is an Irish name, Washington is an English name, and that is not, I'm not Irish nor English. I grew up with that. My father named me Kevin based on a priest that he admired. I do priestly things, and it's part of my life. But I recognize that is not a part of my cultural heritage. Through a process of reintegration, establishing a rites of passage, a process for adults, I was given the name Amawata, NWATA, sensible man, Kairi, who rules with love and humility. After doing a DNA ancestral test, I was able to also uncover that according to African ancestry, my grandmother's, my mother's side is a family is tied to the what's now called Igbo. Therefore, I have the name Chukwuemeka. But and it's interestingly enough, I'd already was given the name Chukwuemeka 20 years before I even knew about this Igbo DNA test. I was already given that name by an Igbo community. So that had already taken place, which means that then that spirit is moving more so than anything else. And then there's Sankara, because currently my father's side, the Bisa, that currently reside in, was part of the Mende tied to Burkina Faso. And so we identify with the prominent leader, Thomas Sankara. Many of his views are there. So therefore you have Sankara. So that explains the migration of the name. From a rites of passage transformation process to ancestral DNA that honors something that is more in alignment with my true identity than the alien construct placed upon me and my family by the oppressor. Okay. Did that
thank you,
help
thank you,
out?
Kevin. Can we maybe take, I see the hand of Dr. Selina Mudau, and then maybe after that, then we can also reflect on some of the comments on the chat box. Dr. Mudau, you can unmute. Dr. Mudau.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. The machine was refusing to act on what I was doing. Thank you so much, Prof, for this insightful presentation. It really opened my mind. It challenged me. I was listening and I was asking myself a lot of questions on how do I now correct myself? And now I came up with a question to say, we are talking about, currently we are talking about decoloniality. We are talking about using the native languages across the board from primary going into higher education, which I really appreciate. And I'm asking myself as I'm looking at this beautiful presentation on how our, I'll call it a native treatment, is used for psychological healing. And I'm asking myself now, how do we now, as educators, as researchers, bring in this kind of research, this kind of knowledge into our curricula so that now we are aligned? And as I was thinking of this, I thought of, and I asked myself the question to say, we are taking our children to private schools where the medium of communication is non-African, if I may put it that way, or non-native for these other kind of people, like the Black and whatever. And I'm asking myself now, how are we growing our children when, to start with, even the name of that child, you spoke about the naming of the child to be Muraro Mashudu, but when you listen to how this name is called, it's kind of westernized. And I ask myself now, where to? How do we bring this awareness from ECDs, crashes, going up into the higher education in the private schools as well, so that we appreciate what you have just presented here today? I hope I have not complicated the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mudau. Yes, Prof, you can respond.
Dr. Mudau, I appreciate the complexity of your question because it speaks to the dynamics of the situation that we find ourselves in. It is very complex. It is not an easy one. It is one where we find ourselves having to go through a European system. We speak right now in a European language to be able to communicate an African issue and or problem. Our children, as I learn a Western system. However, inside of that, the teachers that looked like me, many of them did not use strictly Western modes of addressing the educational process. And I think that we first begin by acknowledging the dynamics or the impact of the oppressor colonization on us, on ourselves. Where are we encapsulated? Where are we locked? Where are we blocked? How are we not fulfilling our true mission? Why do we honor that dishonors us? That's our first bit of homework. That's the first part of the Ubuntu therapeutic process. How do we engage in our own self-reflection, to engage in our introspection, to begin to heal? And then begin to examine what are things have we overlooked? Have we not engaged in? Have we disavowed? Why are we disavowed those things? Has it been serving the oppressor? Has it been serving the community? If it hasn't been good for African people or the indigenous population, then we have to begin to move beyond that and begin to pull back the things that actually work. And those things we see functioning in community that work. Some things don't work in community, but many things do. So our elders are showing us certain things along the way. We've learned certain things. We have documents. We've watched people come through the healing process. We've watched leaders, Nelson Mandela and others, come through processes. So we recognize that there are things that we have to begin to do. Then we infuse those things into the educational system, the process. So in the teaching of chemistry, we then deal with the issue of the word chemistry and chemet, and how it was modified. At some level, it was the mystical process of moving chemicals and certain things that created a different condition in life. Metallurgy comes from Africa. The idea of understanding fabrics and so forth and so on comes from it. So we talk about homemaking, the notion of cooking and food. All those things, mathematics, quantitative skills, come from people that look like us and not from Europeans. So we then take it back, because Pythagoras could not have created geometry when geometric shapes existed in Kemet before there was Pythagoras. So when we begin to infuse back in education the truth, then we're able to make the connections with people to connect with themselves to their own truth. And that's the Ubuntu, that's the connection. But we have become disconnected in the Western education system because we have learned that they have done things great and wonderful and we haven't. So we don't like our languages. Again, we don't like our style of dress. We don't like we don't like our so-called accent or dialect. Everybody has a dialect to everybody in this call right now, because everybody sounds different to everybody. That's okay. So it's a process. And so we talk about, how do we do this in education as an educator, as one who is taught in universities in several places. I've gone to University of KwaZulu Natal and in Fort Hare, where Nelson Mandela went to school, and also University of Cape Town and others in Pretoria. I've looked at that. I've spoken also in Ghana and other places, University of Cape Coast and so forth. So we in Barbados as well, in Cave Hill. So we have these connections where we have paid homage to the oppressor, and that's the disruption that we have to break. But we also make the connection back to, if it had not been for those that look like us, these things wouldn't exist, right? From paper to pen to concepts to constructs of mathematics to chemistry to sciences, to all of that, and that's the deep dive that we have to do. We have to slow it down and go deeply. And that will take some time to get there. But we begin by, first of all, asking ourselves, who are we? As Frantz Fanon said, am I who I say I am, and am I all I ought to be? So I will pause it there, Dr. Madal. I hope that addressed part of what you were asking.
Thank you very
it was
much.
Complex.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, we will look very closely in one of the, in the comments or chat box. There is a question there by Prof. Shannon. I think she's saying, I like that you said no one has ever come to therapy as an individual. And so true. In my view, this redefines a person-centered care. That being said, there are two questions that she's asking. The first one is about what kind of strategies or advice do you have to best help therapists integrate this concept into their work with Black clients? And then there is a second question there which says, how can this understanding be used to support clients in therapy with very little family support, or their family suffering from a variety of societal and spiritual sickness. So maybe you want to respond to that.
I will. Thank you, Priscilla Shannon. I actually know who this person is. So the strategies that we talk about helps the therapist integrate the concepts of this is first, as we stated earlier, we make sure that therapists have their Ubuntu practices in place. Mama Tendai is on this call. We talked about how to honor the ancestors, how to stop and set up your own space, sacred space for healing. How do you honor the fact that you are a seed of 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 these seed, according to Dr. Fukuyama? And so there are certain practices that we set in place that you engage in. What kind of foods are you consuming that facilitate your growth and development? Not simply engaging in whatever you want to engage in, because as an Ubuntu healer, there's a process that you must engage in to make sure that you are clean and pure to move into various spaces. But first of all, that has started with the issue of honoring of the self. And the self is self as communal, that I belong to a community of people, and that the work I'm engaging in is not simply about the work I am doing, but the work that we're doing for one another. You also understand this, Sister Shannon, that within the Western context, when you identify with your client in the psychodynamic approach, it's called, I had the word and just lost it, the idea of identifying with your client too much. That concept does not exist here. We talk about the notion of people coming to our space to facilitate our healing, and we are to heal them. So at some point, recognizing that we're on a journey as therapists, and that the healer's journey has included some of our own pains. And another thing is, how do you help clients to understand this idea of connection? Everyone has moments of connection. We have to begin to examine what extent are those connections strengthening us or weakening us. Whether we're talking about gangs, I came across this in South Africa when we were studying gangs. When I did my Fulbright there in South Africa, it was about well, do you have gangs among the Zulu or the Xhosa? And they said they sort to imitate Black Americans, but we pull them aside and say, remember, you were Zulu. Remember, you were Xhosa. Remember, you were Swana. When you are tied to something bigger than yourself, it's not always in your biological family. You will always be led into a space where you have the healing structures, where people are drawn to you and you're drawn to them to facilitate the healing. We often reject that because it's not familiar to us. We reject it because it makes us have to grow. And that's the problem. However, we cannot only rely on one source of connectivity, but even inside of that, we still recognize that we exist because a seed came before us. You have to always acknowledge that no matter how bad that seed bearer was, we have been imbued with essence from that. And there's something to learn on this journey from that. So that's part of the process. And so we unpack some of that in the book. I wanted to address something else that was a powerful statement here early on, before that one. It says, furthermore, how can we critically, realism be effectively integrated into the framework of to acknowledge the objective reality of psychological suffering while accounting for the subjective interpretation of that. So I wanted to counter transference was the word I lost earlier. It just came back to me in this question. In psychodynamic, I thought it's called counter transference or transference. And so, so when we talk about the nuanced aspect of healing in Ubuntu, we have to deal with the issue of the suffering being a part of the collective, and we have a responsibility as a collective to actually engage in the healing. Even as a therapist, when I'm called into the space, I'm a part of that collective in that moment to facilitate the process of the healing, to make sure that the other structures that come into the space to navigate that. You mentioned about navigate attention between recognizing the interconnectedness of the individual within the social cultural context and the need to address individual psychological distress. The individual, yes, the person has the challenge. And we recognize that the person's a challenge, but many times we say even in counseling that the identified client or person is not the one. The identified person is simply the one that's calling out saying there's a problem in the system. But we do stop and say, listen, you have to get yourself together. You have to put these things in place. But you can only do this to the extent that you recognize that you're connected to other people. It doesn't even work. When you come into therapy, we ask the question, tell me about your family history, which means we're asking about you in context with others. And then you will describe your situation. You will say, I learned this from my mother. I got this from my father, which means person in context with other people. And so then the healing work goes in the same direction. It is how you begin to have the structure of self-realigning with true spirit and then making healthy connections to be able to move you further along the journey. And that's a part of the Ubuntu work. So it is different. And that's the problem, because we think that somehow if I get the person right, then the person will be okay and the system will function. It doesn't work. You can fix one part in the car, but if the car has adjusted or the machine has adjusted around that broken cog, then the machine, then the fixed cog will not function properly because the machine is adjusted around the brokenness. And so we have to understand that the system must be impacted at some level. You have to always see everybody in therapy, but also help someone understand that they are in therapy. For example, last one, Shannon, if I am a drug addict, if I'm using drugs, crack, cocaine, anything else, when I come to visit you, you begin to think like I'm thinking so that things don't come up missing in the house, because you know that I probably will come and steal, which means you have to become sick with me to be able to survive my presence around you. But when I become healed and I tell you I'm coming to visit, you will still move in the sickness, the sick model, because you know that's how I've always functioned around you. So you begin to move like I'm still a crackhead. And so there is an adjustment that has to take place. And everybody, and once you realize that I'm somehow different, you can then adjust how you receive me in space. And so my adjustment allows the system to be adjusted at the same time. That's the process of Ubuntu as well. So it has all those nuances to it. A person is a person because of other people.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mwata Gairi Sankara. There is this other question from Prof. Johan before Bob. She's saying thank you for engaging thought-provoking presentation. But how do we use this understanding to address the high levels of violence? Well, she's specific to say in the Caribbean, but I think your response will help us, because we experience violence throughout. Thank you.
Thank you. So there are multiple causes for the violence that we see. And we have to acknowledge that. People who have been aggressed against have learned how to communicate in the context of violence. The greatest violence that has taken place has been the human trafficking of African people. The raping inside of that, the molestation inside of that, the lynching, the castration inside of that, that is the violence that has tormented the mind. Among the Zulu, Kufu, Kwabantu, the idea of the metaphysical illnesses of the people, there's psychological disruptions that have taken place. And how do we expect all of a sudden for that to disappear within one moment, one generation? It will take some time because it took generations to get there. People have adjusted their lives around the trauma experiences of never having anything but a death and destruction. In the Caribbean, for example, having to grow in Barbados, to grow sugarcane under horrific conditions and having to carry feces, dung, and so forth to fertilize that. I mean, it's been a horrific aspect of dehumanization, and then have children inside of that. So we understand, according to Diaz and Resler, that among mice, they could have trauma passed down from generations. The study showed us that mice can have this smell of a particular a fragrance and then be shocked. So every time they smelled the fragrance, their bodies would have a visceral response as if they were going to be shocked. These mice would have pups, and these pups would have the smell, though they would never be shocked. They would have a visceral response. Those pups would grow up and they would have their own pups who have the smell, but have the same visceral response, though they had never been shocked. That at some level, the aspect of the trauma had been passed down genetically. That is part of epigenetic research. So we have to understand that part of the violence that we see taking place is predicated on violence that's been meted out from generations before it. And so the healing work will have to take some time, but we have to recognize that we're responding to dynamics of perpetual violence, of being dehumanized, less than. How do you want me to behave when everything about me is despised? That's not what we mean by pest, right? That the way I talk and speak and dress and think is despised. How can I respond in any other way? So we have to begin with affirming people first, and it takes time. It's not going to be just, it's not a magic wand. But there's one person within that community of violence. And that, again, here's that notion of community. Among gangs, there's a community of individuals. Among drug users, there's a community. People find ways to connect. So it is finding the linkage within those violent communities to be able to implement. Is it tough? Is it hard? Yes. Some people are more recalcitrant than others, and they will not move quickly. They will not move easily. Some will not. Some will turn on you. That's the nature of this work. So it's not a magic pill, a swoop of a magic wand, and it's waved away. It's a process. And the process begins by first being human ourselves and recognizing those around us as being human. And as a result, it changes things. Many times the people that are violent see themselves as less than human. So we have to begin to move into space to humanize one another. And recognize that it is a process and it is a journey. And they come to us to help us to recognize the journey that we're on. We're challenging multiple levels of violence, and we continue to experience violence, economic violence, emotional violence, other political violence is meted out against us every single day. In the United States, for example, the violence of Make America Great Again is a psychological form of violence because it is about going back to a time where enslaving African people was the thing of the day. That is violence. So how do you want me to respond? I'm going to be frustrated and irritated. I'm going to be violent. And some of us have to say, well, hold on, let's really analyze what's being said here and determine how we will move. That's happening all over the Caribbean, the same thing, right? And so we have to be clear about those things and not try to move outside of that. So the second form of violence, I think that is critical, is cultural violence. How we desire not to be who we are. If we move into the power of being who we are, things will change dramatically. And it happens every time when we align ourselves with our true essence, our true being. It's a process. Can we have more examples of praxis? Praxis such as what, Afia? Can you ask that question about what do we do?
Well,
I can show.
You've been doing that. When I put the question there, you hadn't started giving some of the more recent examples. So,
okay.
Asante.
But it's key to.
But I did put
yes.
another comment in that Mama Tendai responded to and said climatic violence. One of the things that I've been looking at is in our African-centered frameworks, we don't talk enough about our relationships with the environment and our ecology and the disruption that has happened from our African, worldview and using even Ubuntu concept to say that we are connected not just to people, but
yes.
the nature, which is spirit as well.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly right. So in the book, of course, Ubuntu, there's Hantu, Kintu, right? And so there are multiple levels of connectedness in the universe. So that is so true. And so I didn't talk about that, but the NTU is a unifying life force that runs through all things. And so, yes, we can get to the cosmos as well, to humanity, Muntu. So you're right. Thank you. Thank you for that reminder.
Thanks, Prof.
Bonani has a hand up.
Yes. Yeah. Prof. Bonani, you can unmute.
Yes. Yeah, I just want to also appreciate Prof. Washington Mwata Kairi Sankara. Thank you so much. I unfortunately missed the actual presentation, but I caught it up when Prof. Nkwana was giving a very enlightening recap. So, and the conversations are making me wonder, how do we bring it to our campuses? Because as I work in the boundary of academia and communities, encouraging community engagement, what I find is that there's very few of you, Prof, who have probably moved to these levels of awareness. The rest of us, we are paralyzed, this epistemic violence. It's a difficult space to hold on to your own, while at the same time needing to, fulfill the craziness of the, Hollywood kind of spiral, the ratings, the ranking, the, publish or perish, and perhaps it's more of a comment, but I'm asking you to, in your concluding remarks, to just touch on, as a professor, what are the things that you advise us? There are supervisors in this space, there are students in this space. How do you advise us to start where we can start, to hold on to our own? How does it look like? You are obviously a mentor to young academics and students. I will pause there, but obviously I'm encouraged, I'm inspired. It's something, as you indicated, a process. Sometimes it's overwhelming, but I think you give us hope this afternoon that one can do as much as one can do. Thanks.
Your question is one that we struggle with daily, especially in the academy. Thank you, Banani. We struggle with this particular reality of how do we be in the context of that which is against our beingness? How do we be African in an anti-African space and not receive the accoutrements that go along with acquiescing to the oppressor? Because there are a great amount of treasures that come with being anti-African. There is a great deal of laughter in Hollywood. Use it as an example. In one way, there's a great deal of laughter when we have anti-African comedy. There is a great deal of honor. You receive since great accolades if you engage in anti-African research, where you look at issues around how Black children lag behind white children, not the other way around. There's very few bits of research that show the opposite and gets published, right? So we live in a space that is anti-African. So our educational systems only reward us for being unlike ourselves. And that's where we began the conversation by saying that when you have the cast and the structuring, it has to understand the form and formation, the original form and formation of that which is seeking to heal. We understand what it means to be who we are at some level. Some aspects are confusing, other aspects are very clear. The challenge for us is how do we be in a space where we are rewarded for not being who we really are. I have been fortunate enough to have mentors who've gone before me, a Jegna, who have gone before me, who are still around. I still speak with many of them today, who help guide me into this space as we help to guide others. That is to find this space of intellectual liberation, this zone of psychological sovereignty, to be able to suggest that this is how I am to function, and if I must be it in this way. Reading the various scholars such as Paulo Freire and Frantz Fanon, and I've been mentored by, of course, Dr. Ifeabimi Wade Nobles and Dr. Naeem Akbar and Mama Marimba Aini and Dr. Linda James Myers in psychology, and studying and listening to what they had to say and honoring the voice that was within me for a long time. That's where our power comes from. We recognize that when we take a stance in the context of our oppressor, things begin to shift. It is when we move in our when we move in the fear of how we will be received by others, we find ourselves being crushed. But when we begin to honor the power within, we begin to honor the ancestors, Abapanzi, but when we begin to move in the strength of the Abasun, we move in the strength of understanding that then things begin to change around us. We know that there's a lot to honor. When we begin to speak the truth about what we see in education coming from an African reality, we begin to understand that there is no notion of humanity within the context of European models, that even their psychologists and psychiatrists got their content from African people. We know that the collective unconscious comes from Carl Gustav Jung studying with his cousin who studied with Sengomas in South Africa, which means in reality, then his theory is South African and not an issue of you being European. We know that Sigmund Freud studied the idea of the unconscious and then studied dreams and so forth. So that came out of ancient Kemet because he had statues on his desk. You can see the pictures of them from ancient Kemet and or Egypt. We can point these out and say, here are the facts that your people have studied this from our people. We operate as if you are the originator when you are simply the imitator, and that we are part of the original. When we recognize that we are a seed of 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 these seed, it changes things. When we stand up in the power of our being, it causes everything around us to have to adjust. We have an opportunity to either be a thermostat or a thermometer. A thermometer simply measures the temperature in the room. A thermostat changes the atmosphere. In the academy, when we begin to stand up in the knowledge of who we are, it changes us, because remember, the academy is not about a top-down process. The academy is a bottom-up process. There is no academy without students. And so the students begin to say, this is what I came to school for. As we begin to put in this truth, the student body will rise and say, this is what I came for, and come for this stuff. I came to understand more about myself and how to be empowered. That's the transformative process. It is a grassroots, a bottom-up process, and we keep thinking that it's a top-down process. The top is not going to understand it because they simply are drunken by the accoutrements that they have received from those that say, be unlike yourself. But the bottom-up says, I desire to be more and be better. And that's our obligation and duty to one another, is to facilitate being better and being more. But it only begins with us being more and being better, to recognize that we only exist because others came before us, to recognize that we're on a journey and not a destination. This is a process of unfolding and unpacking. And as we live this life, doing what we have been called forth to do in purpose, everybody else can rise in power. It's a process. And the power comes through honoring the fact that I am the seed of a seed of a seed of a seed of the seed, which means I can do all things but fail. Victory is inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mwata Kairi Sankara. Prof, in some of the comments in the chat, I see Jerome. I think Jerome is indirectly asking a question there. He said, drawn from his own experiences as a teacher in South Africa, he has observed learners who observe African spirituality, whether they are going to be divine and spirits, priest of medium with amatrosi. But his concern is how school can, create an accommodating and understanding learning environment without the discrimination of people observing their African spirituality.
So we have in the West, we honor at this point, this time of the year, under Ramadan, which is an Abrahamic religious experience. We acknowledge those of Christian faith who are in the season of Lent. We have the capacity to honor all things that are Abrahamic and are accepted by Europeans. However, we tend to struggle when it comes to honoring that which is African. That speaks to the dynamics of trauma, which is why I talked about the issue of pest. What Dr. Bonani mentioned is a form of pest. How do I teach this in the context of those that are coming against me? That's why I say it is not a post moment. It's persistent. It is ongoing. Now we can spend all of the time, we can honor all of those, but when it comes to honoring those that come from, that we came from, that gave rise to what we see right now, we recognize that the headwear that's worn by the Pope came from ancient Kemet. The dress of those among the clerics in the Catholic Church come from African attire. The practices of incense burning and candle burning come from African society. They do not do that in Europe at all, right? All of those things are part of a tradition of understanding spirit and spirituality. We have to respect the fact that we know how to make connections for ourselves. We don't have to go through them to make the connection. We've done it with Candomblé and Santeria. We've taken the various notions of the Orishas and tied them to the saints of the Roman Catholic Church. It's been done. We don't have to always live in that space, but we're not honoring the Roman Catholic reality. We're honoring our own ancestry. So the process then is that if we can carve out spaces for individuals to observe the Abrahamic religious expressions, then we can also do the same thing for that which is indigenous African. We cannot always be afraid of it. The fear comes from the Europeans who recognize that when we tapped into it, we were able to be powerful. That has been the bane of the existence of Haiti. I was tapping into that spirituality stung by Boukman to know where the power comes from. Those in Haiti said that, how are we going to take on the oppressor when they have all the guns? And it was Boukman and others said that, listen, everything you have is a weapon. A spoon is a weapon. A fork is a weapon. A hoe is a weapon. Everything you have, a knife is a weapon. Use everything you have, because if God gave every animal something to defend itself against its enemy, why is not God giving you the same capacity to defend yourself from your enemy? Powerful message in Haiti. So we see these messages over and over again, that when you stand in your power, when you rise in your power, then things change around you. And so we can honor everything but African. We can honor people who shovel elephant feces. We can honor people who scoop a whale poop from the bottom of the ocean, but we cannot honor Africanity. That's a powerful piece. And it's not them. The issue is that when do we honor it for ourselves? And so this is how we begin to honor it, by what we call ourselves, how we think, what do we do? And so the process is, you as the teacher set the tone. And if you have space for everybody else, we're going to have space for this as well. Because it's not disrespecting anything, it's actually honoring those that came before me. And so that's the process. Now we talk about harming people, that's another situation. But anyway, that's a deeper call, deeper dive, because I don't want to go there with Western religion and how it has harmed people in the name of its creators. But I do want to say that we have the obligation and duty to honor, and we have the capacity to do so whenever we choose to do so.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mwata Kairi Sankara. I'm going to give over to Prof. Bonani to do the concluding remarks and thanking Prof. Mwata Kairi Sankara and everybody who's on the platform. I think we were blessed to have you with us, and then to come and then share. I think if we look even at the comments, people are thanking you, Prof, for what you have shared with us. They said this was very informative, this was beautiful. I think this was more liberating, and this is also calling for our consciousness, not to rest in our laurels, but to always being aware, to say we are still fighting the monster of disfranchisement, segregation, all sorts of evils that are there. So, but thank you very much. Let me pause there and then give over to Prof. Bonani. And Prof. Bonani, please, over to you. And thanks, Prof. Sankara.
Yes. Yeah, I want to start, Prof. Sankara, where you ended. Yes, if we choose to, we can start, we can honor our Africanity unapologetically. Difficult because we are wired and oriented. We were trained for many of us in something that we need to unlearn, relearn, renovate, and it's that with a choice to be that kind of a supervisor, that kind of a professor, and I think, Prof, as we celebrate the Human Rights Day tomorrow in South Africa, you've given us food for thought. We definitely going to be reflecting on this one. And ours is to really appreciate, we really are blessed, as Prof. Nkwana has indicated. We don't take this privilege for granted and would like to have you back, actually, because yeah, there are limitations of time, and our different universities will be inviting you as well on different platforms. So we really want to appreciate, I want to appreciate our colleagues from the Caribbean and across the world. It's in the eve of a long weekend in South Africa. Most of universities have now taken even Friday to have a long weekend. So we will be reflecting. This is about also networking. For the rest of us in South Africa who are at the start of a long weekend, we really appreciate that you took time. This was recorded as well, and we would like to engage further. This is why we come together. This is why, with the connection that we have built in this platform, we are able to be blessed because we attract the kind of Professor Sankara. So I think be encouraged, be inspired. We will be continuing with that, and please look out for the invitation for next week. And I wish you all the best with the long weekend. All the blessing. Hi, Alicia. Thank you so much.
That was my thank you. My thank you was to Dr. Alicia Blackwood. I was about to say that, Dr. Bonani.
Yes.
Big thanks to Dr. Blackwood for this opportunity to speak.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Have a blessed day ahead. Enjoy your holiday. Be reflective to colleagues across the ocean. Have a blessed one. We will stay in touch. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.